So hello and welcome everyone to a webinar kicking off the EU Values Network webinar series for 2025. I'm Emily Jones, your host and moderator. Actually, I think we've waited a few minutes now. We've got a few people in the room, so we can start. What a year it's already been, and we're very excited today to be joined by Dr. T.Theuns, a distinguished senior assistant professor of political theory and European politics at Leiden University's Institute of Political Science. Dr. T.Theuns' research examines EU legitimacy, democratic backsliding, and institutional responses to democratic crises, with a particular emphasis on the right to vote and the tension between democratic ideals and EU policies. He has contributed extensively to leading journals, including the American Political Science Review and the Journal of European Integration, and is a regular commentator on European political affairs. In 2021, he commenced a 4-year Veni grant from the Dutch Research Council for his project Protecting Democracy in Europe, and today we're very pleased to hear more about this project in his presentation of his recently published book. We're also delighted to present our discussant for the session, Professor Vivian Anne Schmidt, the Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration and Professor of International Relations and Political Science at Boston University, where she's also served as the founding director of the Center for the Study of Europe. Vivian's research has looked at European political economy, institutions, democracy, and political theory, with a notable focus on the role of ideas and discourse in political analysis. Together, both speakers bring a wealth of expertise on European governance and democracy, and we're sure they'll provide a fascinating and thought-provoking discussion.
Okay. No.
I'm just going to ask everyone to make sure they're on mute. Sorry for that. Thank you. So as I was saying, we really hope they'll provide a fascinating and thought-provoking discussion for us today to kind of launch our series for this year. Which should explore the pressing challenges confronting European integration and democratic institutions today. This session is hosted by the EU Values Network, a collaborative Jean Monnet network aiming to create dialogue and a broader understanding of the EU's normative values. Do check out our website if you'd like to know more about us, follow us online, and if you like today's session or indeed any of our work, it would be incredibly helpful for us if you could follow us online and sign up to our mailing list. We are about to next week release our quarterly newsletter. So that will include curated reading lists relating to the promotion and protection of democracy, in fact. So do sign up. On behalf of our network, I would like to thank Tom, Vivian, and all of you in the audience today. I will now hand over to you, Tom. The floor is yours. I believe you have your slides ready. So over to you.
Yes, thank you, Emily, for that lovely introduction. Just to make sure, can everybody see only the slides, or do you also see this, these Zoom controls? You don't see them, do you?
No, just the screen.
All Perfect. Good. All right. Because my screen has some other things going on as well. So thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks for EU Values for hosting, and of course, Professor Vivian Schmidt for agreeing to act as discussant. It's a great honor, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. I have just published the book that I'm presenting in November with Hurst. It's coming out in March with Oxford University Press. And the title of the book is Protecting Democracy in Europe, Pluralism, Autocracy, and the Future of the EU. So I'm just going to now spend a few minutes sketching out the overall kind of project, and then zooming in very quickly on the individual chapters, and if you'd like to have some more detail on that, then let's pick that up in the Q&A. So this is the overall structure of the book. So the book has 2 parts. The first part uses the tools of political theory to evaluate the responses by European actors, including the European Commission, to democratic backsliding in EU member states. So the first half of the book is largely evaluative, and the second half of the book is largely prescriptive. So there I try to lay out a different approach that EU actors could take in protecting democracy in Europe, so in responding to democratic backsliding in EU member states. And you can see that that there's some different things going on in these two parts. So the first substantive chapter, chapter 2, takes a kind of historical lens to look at the last 20, 25, 30 years of EU responses. And the third chapter looks at discourses of European commissioners with regard to democracy, whereas the fourth is more strictly speaking philosophical chapter, which looks at kind of imminent critique of existing EU legal and political tools for responding to democratic backsliding. In the second half of the book, then, the first 3 chapters of that part, 5, 6, and 7, lay out an overall strategy, which I call coherent democracy protection, where the first priority, which is described in chapter 5, is correcting the complicity that EU actors have in democratic backsliding. Chapter 6 focuses on containing autocratic actors in European law and policy making, and chapter 7 focuses on cultivating pluralist democracy in member states where pluralist democracy is under threat. The last chapter, then, chapter 8, asks what would be the legitimate final sanction for democratic backsliding if this coherent strategy of coherent democracy protection would fail. And there I argue that if the European Union and European institutions and actors were to pursue a coherent strategy of democracy protection, which would nevertheless fail, and the member state was to become, frankly, autocratic in that context, then the legitimate final sanction would be expulsion from the European Union. All right, so let's start then with that second chapter, the first substantive chapter of the book, about the kind of historical lens of looking at democratic backsliding and responses to democratic backsliding by member states, by EU actors. I argue that basically there's 2 interesting clues if we think about how since 2010 or so, when we start to see serious democratic backsliding in Hungary especially, why the responses and how the responses were so weak and technocratic and legalistic, which is the overall cast that I think describes especially the first decade of responses from 2010 and to 2020, roughly. And I focus on 2 aspects, 2 features of European integration in the 90s and early 2000s. One, I argue, is the idea of membership fatalism. It's the idea that each member state has total and final sovereignty over their membership, in spite of governance failures and fundamental rights violations. And secondly, the idea of depoliticization. So depoliticizing these responses to fundamental rights violations, the idea that instead of a kind of political response, the primary arena for responding to regressions on liberal democratic norms is the judicial one, and unanimity is a political prerequisite for robust action. Now, I link these 2 features of the EU response and 2 things that help us understand why, in my view, the responses since 2010 have been so feeble. I link those to specific developments in EU integration history. On the one hand, I focus on the enlargement of the 1990s. So the idea that with this big enlargement, there was a lot of worry about new member states from the former Eastern blocs, the Central and Eastern European states joining the European Union were potentially not stable. So there needed to be some kind of values mechanism, which became Article 7. However, we also have in this period, interestingly, the contestation, the real contestation, also amongst the earlier members of the democratic character of the European Union. We see this in the expansion of the authority of the European Parliament and so forth, and the rise of Euroscepticism. And I try to tell a story about how these things come together in the creation, on the one hand, of a sanctions mechanism that is now Article 7, but on the other hand, of first discussing and then rejecting the idea of expelling a member state for violating fundamental values, which are now enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. On the other hand, the other development that I describe in this chapter in relation to these 2 features, membership fatalism and depoliticization, is the response of European Union member state governments and European institutions to the inclusion in the year 2000 of a far-right party in the Austrian government. So in the 1999 Austrian general elections, the far-right FPÖ, those who gained first place in the recent elections last year, came in second place, just ahead of the center-right ÖVP, ÖVP party. And what initially was expected was that the SPÖ and the ÖVP would form a coalition together. So the center-left and the center-right parties would form a coalition together. But those negotiations broke down quite quickly, and the far-right party and the center-right party started negotiations to form a government together for the first time. Now, this wouldn't be the first time that the FPÖ was in government, because they had previously been in government with the center-left in the 1980s, but at that time were not a far-right, but rather a liberal party. So the party had changed a great deal since then. And the response from European Union member states was immediate and quite political. So under the leadership of Costa and Portugal, who held the rotating presidency of the Council at the time, a series of bilateral sanctions were imposed, diplomatic sanctions, on the Austrian government. But the way in which that's negotiated and then plays out, the chapter tries to argue, was ultimately rather feeble and led quite quickly to a reversal. Within a year, all sanctions were withdrawn, and the far-right inclusion in the Austrian government was basically had become accepted by the end of the year 2000. And this kind of this awkward backtracking, first the failure of the pressure on the Austrian center-right party to not form a coalition with the far right, and then the failure also of any kind of sustainable political boycott was rather embarrassing, and set up this idea that this political direct and political responses to democratic threats were in fact undesirable. And we have some interesting quotes by some leaders of the European Commission. For example, Timmermans gave a speech in Tilburg where he points this out. He says that, you know, we whatever we want to do in terms of the response to Hungary then in 2010, we wanted to avoid what happened in Austria 10 years before. Okay, let's move on to then the second chapter. So I'll go over this very quickly. This is based on empirical research that I've done initially with Álvaro Oliart, who's a postdoctoral researcher in the ULB in Brussels. And in this chapter, so I expand, temporally expand and focus on certain commissioners, a data set that I first created with Álvaro for an article published in JCMS. And we look, in this chapter then I look at the frames used by commissioners when speaking about democracy. And the procedure here methodologically is very straightforward. All of the publicly available speeches by commissioners were coded, that use the word democracy or democratic, were coded in a way to try to understand how commissioners are using the word democracy and what they're referring to, what they mean. And as you can see from this figure, the vast majority of references to democracy by commissioners in the period that I studied were to the dimension of democracy that focuses on the rule of law and human rights or fundamental rights. Other major frames in the use of the word democracy were the quality of information, so that democracy needs high quality information, geopolitical threats, media freedom, and then as we go down, the international cooperation, data or cybersecurity are also fairly frequent. We see that some of the core features of democracy, if we were to take a kind of standard political science or political theory definition of democracy, things like pluralism and elections, is almost absent from the speeches of commissioners and the way that they use the word democracy. And the references that we do have to elections, they tend to be, or to parliaments, for example, they tend to be to the European Parliament. They tend to be rather abstract references. Very, very rarely do we see any commissioner refer to democracy in terms of contestation, in terms of political pluralism, or ideological pluralism. Now, I think that's interesting because that tracks, in fact, the way the Commission in this period and before, since 2010, responds to democratic backsliding, right? So it's prioritizing these rule of law, focused legalistic responses, rather than looking at how democratic backsliding undermines political pluralism and the possibilities for ideological contestation in what could be referred to as a fair playing field. So these conceptualization of democracy, which we call democracy without politics, it seems to track onto the way that the European Commission also responds to violations of democratic values. Then in the fourth chapter, I do something a bit different, and I look at the normative coherence or the philosophical coherence of the tools that the EU has to respond to violations of fundamental values such as democracy and the rule of law. So here are four of the tools that involve sanctions. I only look in this chapter at tools which involve sanctions because generally I'm a rather skeptical about the efficacy of the softer kind of monitoring and dialogue mechanisms that exist. So the four sanctions tools, we have infringement actions under Articles 258 to 260 of the TFEU. We have the various conditionality regulations, of which the most well-known is the rule of law conditionality regulation. We have the possibility, although never used to sanctioning effect, the possibility of deregistering EU parties and foundations for violating Article 2 under Regulation 1141. And we have the Article 7 procedure in Article 7 TEU for sanctioning fundamental values violations by an EU member state government. And essentially what I try to do in this chapter is I try to see to what extent these sanctions and these mechanisms are themselves coherent with EU fundamental values as listed in Article 2. So this has an immanent critique structure, taking the values from the legal and political praxis and seeing the extent to which these mechanisms live up to those values themselves. Without going into too much detail, I argue that infringement proceedings, so using 258 to 260 TFEU, or using different sorts of conditionality rules are coherent ways to respond, so do not undermine fundamental values, whereas deregistering an EU party or foundation, especially an EU party, and Article 7 risk violating EU fundamental values in how the sanction plays out. I'll give you the example of Article 7. Article 7, the sanction is disenfranchising a member state government in the council, but that's the listed sanction. It's an open-ended sanction, but that's the example that's given, but explicitly holding that member state subject to the law and policy making, which is co-decided in the council. Now, I argue that this violates what's known in democratic theory as the all-subjected principle. Now, for those reasons, I think there's an a priori kind of normative argument for prioritizing these coherent sanctions, right? So infringement proceedings and the rule of law conditionality regulation. Although, as you'll see as I go into the substantive chapters of the second part of the book, my strategy for coherently responding to violations of democratic values in EU member states, it focuses also on many other things. Infringement proceedings and conditionality have a role to play, but I think should be supplemented by a host of other responses. All right, so moving on then quickly to part 2 of the book and these trio of chapters that try to lay out a different strategy. Firstly, I focus in chapter 5 on correcting EU complicity. So here, the idea is that an actor is complicit when, sorry, clicked ahead by accident, when they, through a wrongful action or omission, enable, induce, encourage, or permit another wrongful action. So it's a specific kind of ethical failing. And focusing on the theory of complicity laid out by Chiara Lepora and Bob Goodin, I point out that omission, so wrongful omission, is just as generative of complicity as wrongful action. It's a kind of secondary contribution to a primary wrong, whether or not it takes the form of an active contribution. Now, why is this interesting? I think it's interesting because the scope of complicity, when we look at complicity of EU actors in democratic backsliding, is far larger than we usually suppose. So there's some interesting work on the complicity, for example, of the EPP in protecting Fidesz, the Hungarian, or Viktor Orban's party in Hungary, protecting Fidesz in the European Parliament. But I think if we include in complicity wrongful omissions, we actually see that a whole host of actors ought to have responded differently to democratic backsliding, had the duty to respond, either the duty that they held vis-a-vis their citizens, if we're talking about member state governments, or, for example, the Commission's duty to act as guardian of the treaties and so on, right? So as we expand the scope of complicity, as we include more actors in the category of complicit with democratic backsliding, they generate duties of redress and reparations. Redress, that is to say, stopping that activity which causes complicity, and in the case of an omission, that's omitting the response that's required from that actor normatively, but also reparations. So I argue that complicit actors have duties to those harmed by backsliding. Centrally, that's the citizens of governments who have backslidden on democratic values. So, for example, that means that member state governments of states that are not backsliding on democratic values may, in fact, have duties of reparation, so duties they hold towards the citizens of states where democracy has been undermined by the governments of those states. We'll come back to, so that's one of the reasons why in Chapter 7 I argue that these actors have duties of cultivating pluralist democracy in those states. To move on to Chapter 6, so I lay out various strategies for containing autocracy and discuss some examples. Generally speaking, in this chapter, I try to argue for the principle that a frankly autocratic member state government should be maximally excluded from EU law and policy making to the degree that that is coherent with EU fundamental values. Right, so this follows quite neatly from the argument, then the coherence-based immanent critique argument from chapter 4. I briefly discussed different kind of categories of containment. So economic containment, like the use of the pursuit of large fines by the Commission via infringement actions, or theoretically by member state governments in infringement actions, although they rarely use them, and the imposition of budget conditionality, but also hard legal containment, so excluding a frankly autocratic government, for example, from the presidency of the Council, as was a discussion regarding the Hungarian presidency, which took place between June and December last year, and political containment, so depriving and starving authoritarian politicians of political oxygen and symbolic legitimacy wherever possible. We can talk more about those examples if you're interested in the Q&A. In the 7th chapter, then, I argue that one of the ways in which these duties of reparations can be expressed, but also on the grounds of other independent reasons to support pluralist democracy in European Union member states, one of them being that European integration means that the backsliding of one member state on democratic and rule of law grounds directly impacts the citizens of other member states whose rules are co-decided then by an authoritarian actor. There are many different kind of grounds for these responses, but this generates a duty, or these things generate duties of cultivating pluralist democracy where it's under threat. And here I mean basically the support of those actors that are fighting to protect democratic pluralism, from the civil society actors like NGOs that are working in that terrain, to independent judges, independent media, and opposition politicians and parties that are resisting autocratization. Now, here, basically, the chapter takes on and tries to respond to several objections. One of them is that this kind of interference, especially when coming from an EU actor, would be itself incoherent with Article 2 values, because it would not uphold principles of kind of political neutrality that European Union actors are supposed to uphold, or another version of this, that it would be illiberal in terms of its political partisanship, right? Taking a particular position, especially when we're talking about the support for an opposition political party, municipality, or politician. But here I argue that the principle that should determine the legitimacy of such interventions is that, to the extent that they serve to correct democratic distortions, they actually are legitimate, right? So the more democratically distorted a domestic playing field, so the more a country has backslidden on democratic values, the more legitimate it is for actors, even those who are ordinarily held to kind of neutrality norms, the more legitimate it is for those to become involved in supporting these partisan actors. All right, so the last chapter, Quo Vadis, so where do we go from here, argues for the legitimacy of expulsion as the coherent final sanction of democratic backsliding. Now, the idea basically here is that coherency demands, so the demand that European Union actors respond to democratic backsliding in ways that are coherent with fundamental values, raises the possibility that all of the legitimate responses available would not go far enough, would not be enough for a backsliding member state to remain democratic, right? So there's we can exclude some very coercive responses, for example, which would not be coherent. We can exclude some deeply anti-democratic responses, which would not be coherent. And for that reason, we need to entertain the possibility that these self-imposed restrictions on the range of, or the scope of legitimate responses means that the responses fail in terms of keeping a member state to a kind of minimal criterion of democratic governance. In that context, I argue that expulsion is the legitimate and appropriate final sanction. So in contrast with Article 7, which strips a member state violating fundamental values of their right to vote in the council, expulsion would not violate the all-subjected principle, because an expelled member state would no longer be held subject to the laws and policies of European Union decision-making. So that's the kind of difference that I try to lay out. I do that with reference to the literature on militant democracy centrally, which tries to ask this question of when it might be coherent to use anti-democratic tools to protect democracy under threat. We can talk more about that theory of militant democracy if that's interesting to you in the Q&A. But that's where I end my story, and it seems like a kind of radical place to end, perhaps. Expulsion is not a, or at least certainly not when I started this project, wasn't a frequently discussed point, but I think it's also rather extreme, and I try to develop that in part 2. It's also rather extreme to hold the view, I think, that no matter what a member state would do, no matter how grave the violations of fundamental values or human rights that a member state government might entertain, they ought to continue to be integrated with other member states in terms of their supranational rights to co-governance and so forth, which is, I think, also a rather extreme position. All right, thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to Professor Schmidt's responses and then also your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom. That was super interesting. A great presentation and overview of your book. Would you mind, sorry, popping down the slides, if that's okay? So then we can... Yes, brilliant. Thank you very much. There you go. On to gallery there. What a week to be discussing democracy, rule of law, and its relation to politics. So just great. Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. And I'd like to remind our audience today that the Q&A will begin more soon. So I invite you to send any comments you have in that Q&A box down there. So yes, now we will turn to our expert discussant, Professor Vivian Schmidt, for her thoughts and reflection.
So first, I'd just like to thank you, the organizers of the event. I'm delighted to be attending, and thank you, Tom, for writing this wonderful book. So I find the book a brilliant piece of scholarship. I really like it. So I actually don't have many major criticisms of the main arguments, but I have a number of questions that I'll get to. So first, I'm going to begin with my view of the most important insights of the book, and then get to the questions. And one thing I should note is I think my internet connection is a bit unstable, so just bear with me. I've been noticing when Tom was talking every now and again, it cut out for a few seconds. So hopefully it won't cut out more than a few seconds. So just stick with me and I'll come on if it actually fades completely, but hopefully not. Okay, so the book itself provides really important insights into the ways in which the Commission understood its mandate, how it conceived of democracy, how it interpreted EU law very narrowly with regard to questions of democratic backsliding. And what's really nice is that it also deals with the member states and their logics of interaction that were also no help in addressing these issues. It's important. This is not just about the Commission and rule of law. It's also a bit, not a lot, but a bit about the kind of politics in the member states, especially when we get certain cases like Austria, etc. And indeed, the book is actually a major indictment of the Commission for policies and its discursive constructions of democracy. And I think this is really key to understanding what went on. I certainly learned a tremendous amount with regard to the intricacies of EU law and the way it serves to constrain Commission action, but also how the Commission's own narrow and technical interpretations further limited EU law. It's about how the Commission itself saw its own remit in terms of what it does and what it doesn't do. As we heard, it's about omission as much as commission by the Commission. Anyway, really important, I find the book with regard to its discourse analysis, revealing an impoverished view of democracy. This, of course, I like even more because it fits beautifully with my own analytic framework of discursive institutionalism, focused on the substantive content of ideas and agent discursive interactions in institutional context. And what's also actually really wonderful is the way in which it talks about EU democracy and legitimacy and shows how they are at risk where the laws are applied unequally. And the need then, I mean, this is what's great about this is really a political theory book that doesn't stay at just at the level of political theory, but really gets you down into the practical application in terms of law and policy. And notably, and I think this is important to point out, the approach itself is not typical political theory taking an ideal kind of approach, i.e. what ought to be, looking at what ought to be is imposed on what is. And it's rather what Tom calls a practical theoretical approach, or rather it's a practical theoretical approach in terms of what Tom calls practice dependence orientation. And this is a much broader approach, which is much more open to a wide range of empirical methodologies. And this too makes this book not simply an exercise in political theory, but also a demonstration of what it means on the ground. As such, it will be very useful, I think, for practitioners and policymakers as much as scholars of democracy. So in that way, it's also a very nice mix. Now, I just want to briefly touch on the different chapters and the things that struck me most, also in terms of methodology as well as content. And one is, say, just starting in chapter 2, genealogy. Love that use of the word. Remember, it starts with Nietzsche, although you don't mention him. And it's picked up by others, etc. And I think it was done a wonderful way of sort of using genealogy, as Tom said, basically using history but looking backwards, but not in a deterministic way, but rather in terms of seeing how do the current problems actually fit in the history of what actually was done, what the discourse was, what the policies were, etc. And what Tom shows is that the genealogy shows that member state actions ended up leading to major weak mechanisms. And we've heard about them, so I'm not going to repeat this. Membership fatalism and depoliticization of the issues, both really very nice ways of encapsulating what the problems were. Chapter 3, again, I love it. Framing analysis, again, fits under discursive institutionalism, but it's a very revealing framing analysis of commission speeches on sort of its own technocratic and thin understanding of democracy. And here, Tom really focuses in on this vision of democracy without politics. I like this also because it's different but similar to more I talked about in my 2006 book as the EU policy without politics, which I looked at from a much more general level. And what I saw was increasingly, however, and this is, I think, part of a question for later, is that the Commission increasingly went from policy without politics to policy with politics, especially starting with Juncker and the Commission. So what, I mean, one query is, why do we see it in terms of the social pillar and the Eurozone crisis, but not on democratic backsliding? You know, why did politics stop? Is it about the member states? Is it something else? So then chapter 4, imminent critique as a normative theory method in which one expects political practice not to violate its own normative premises. This again is a lovely, I mean, what's again wonderful about the book is it doesn't use one method or two, it uses a whole series of different kinds of empirical methodologies to reveal the kind of the political theoretical issues. And this too is a wonderful way of getting at the problems of actually a kind of practice dependent approach, where instead of saying, okay, this is wrong because here's my political theory, you're saying, well, let's hold the Commission up to its own values, to the values that are inherent in the EU constitution, if you will, itself, in the kind of democratic values that the EU says it upholds, that the Commission is the guardian of the treaties and thus expected to uphold the values, and yet it doesn't. And so in this way, this chapter is really lovely as a critique and as an imminent critique of that. And again, talking about issues of normative coherence and incoherence and expressive consistency, all really lovely terms that I think scholars will find very, very useful as they try to apply this kind of theoretical and methodological approach in other areas of the EU and more generally. Okay, now, so that's sort of, so that those are perhaps the analytic part. No, everything's analytic here, but sort of the part that says, okay, let's critique. But what's really nice is that Tom, rather than waiting till the conclusion to say, okay, here are a few little ways in which I'm going to help you figure out how to get beyond this, as most scholars do, and I am also guilty of this. Rather, part 2 is really, really important because we get not simply first part, a critique, but now proposals for how to remedy the situation. This is really important and relatively rare, except if you get someone who's just doing kind of normative, kind of policy focused argument. So this book outlines the second part outlines practical ways of addressing the problem, and in particular, focusing on pluralist democracy. So we start with chapter 5 and analyzes broad complicity and how to redress it. And I really like this. And we get here very useful a sense of the kinds of instruments that the Commission has, the justice score. I mean, what's extraordinary seeing how many instruments that suggest that the Commission is seriously addressing these issues. The justice scorecard in 2013, the rule of law framework in 2014, the rule of law mechanism in 2019. Wow, you think, amazing. And nothing really emerges out of it. So, it makes me ask, is this, just sort of talk or rhetoric without follow through? Discourse that is emptied of substance because it's just discourse and there is no follow through. Chapter 6 then suggests, okay, here are ways in which we might be able to get beyond this: containment by conditionality through economic sanctions. Although one asks, okay, if you do economic sanctions, doesn't this hurt citizens? If we know about sanctions generally, whenever they're used in international contexts, it's often the citizens who are hurt, and the governments continue. So they backfire. So that would be one question that might be taken into account. And then another, in terms of containment, is political legitimacy, denying political legitimacy to the regime, and prestige. Although, this, not shaking people's hands, as in the Austrian case. How far does that kind of isolation really take us? Maybe it's a bit weak, perhaps just too simply performative. How effective? Especially since it's already been tried. These are questions, but admittedly, what else are you going to do? And then the 7th chapter says, okay, here's what else you do: encouraging pluralist democracy at the national level. And again, really great ideas that ought to be implemented by the Commission. Giving money directly to civil society organizations, to critical media, to opposition-held municipalities. Perhaps you can do this in the name of subsidiarity. But how effective is this? Also, given that what we've seen in democratically backsliding governments, such things as outlawing giving money to civil society organizations that come from outside. How do they do this in terms of the EU is a question. But again, I think it's tremendously important to talk about encouraging pluralist democracy at the national level. But how do you do that when it's being shut down at the national level by the governments themselves? And then, the one thing and here I'm going to start with the questions, is why only pluralist democracy at the national level? In the book, that's where, Tom, you kind of end. But what about the EU level? It reminds me of my own more general recommendations, again, in the concluding chapter of my 2006 book on democracy in Europe, where I talked about the need, because of the kind of split level democracy where politics is at the national level and sort of political legitimacy, if you will, is at the national level, and it's about performance legitimacy or procedural legitimacy at the EU level. Why not try to encourage more pluralist democracy at the EU level, to bring more civil society groups involved in Commission decision making, where we know there's a bit of that, but it's mainly business that's involved. But why not encourage social activist citizens from backsliding countries to form groups that coordinate at the EU level to exert pressure for help in formulation of laws and instruments, and also bring those sort of opposition parties and citizens together at the EU level, but also in interaction with the Commission. So in addition to the European Parliament, this might be another way to form a kind of discursive set of actions at the EU level to kind of push the Commission to do more, and the member states. But that was, let's call that question 1. So question 2 would be, had the EU Commission done more, would this have actually stopped the problem? If we think about it, the illiberal, if not authoritarian drift is everywhere. And isn't it possible that had the EU acted as aggressively as you suggest it might have, wouldn't there have been major backlash? And wasn't that one of the Commission's major hesitations in not doing more? Third, we've actually reached a moment where the liberal order, including liberal democracy, is being challenged everywhere and is under great threat. And in a way, this is coming from the people themselves. So here we can think about populist messengers with their post-truth, us versus them messengers that resonate everywhere. Okay, partially due to social media, but also due to a milieu of people feeling left behind, concerned about the cost of living in an increasingly unequal world, worried about loss of social status, worried about immigration, and wanting to take back control from global forces, but also Europeanization. So there's that too. There is that the people, it's so the book is written on the assumption that everyone's against democratic backsliding. But at the point at which you're seeing it everywhere, maybe everyone is not against it. So in a way, who do we blame for the erosion of democracy and democratic backsliding? I think the next book will have to be on how do we stem the tide of illiberalism everywhere using current tools. So, fourth question, how do we deal with the electoral changes in member states leading to illiberal partisans in power? Populist extremes now, in a way, accept the EU. They just want a different one, a Europe of nations with their own values. And they want to be free to redesign their institutions in an illiberal manner without the sort of the traditional institutional checks and balances. And member state leaders are increasingly reflecting the preferences of their own citizens. And those citizens are increasingly voting for liberal politicians. What happens by 2027 with elections in France, Marine Le Pen, with Austria already seeming to go under the thumb of Kinkel, the Netherlands already in an illiberal coalition, if you will, Sweden, many Central Eastern European countries, not just Hungary, Meloni in Italy, Orban in Poland, Kaczynski perhaps back. What happens now? In a way, would militant democracy be justified here as per chapter 8? But who would be left to do it? In the EU, with this nightmare scenario, maybe it's the last democracy that would be ejected. Which one would that be? Belgium? Okay, so, I suppose this is sounding very, very glum, but having just witnessed the coronation of a new president in the United States, who is the very incarnation of democratic backsliding, there are questions of where do we go from here? This can get us to talk about the failures, and I think that may be another piece of this that we don't see in the book, but obviously this is way beyond your remit. Can't talk about everything in one book, but one needs to also talk about the failures of liberal democracy and the supranational EU in being unable to deliver what citizens want and need. Think about the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, neither of which produced much in the way of positive benefits to the EU as a whole. Yes, COVID-19 crisis did, but perhaps that's just a hiatus. Okay, I don't want to end on this pretty depressing note, so let's get back to comments about the book itself. Overall, I think this is a really important book on a really important topic with very important insights, not just on this issue, but also more generally for democracy and democratic legitimacy in the EU. So thanks, and thank you for the book.
Thank you, Vivian. Thanks so much for your insights, and well, it's great to hear how you found it to fit so well with your own research framework. Tom, you obviously have some potential huge ideas there for big topics for the next book as well. And if you wish, you may take a few minutes or so to respond to Vivian's questions and reflections, and then we will move on to the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Vivian and Emily. Yeah, I really can't do these questions justice and still have any time for a Q&A at all. But I'll just pick up a couple of points. So on the empirics, I've been, I suppose, rather obsessive about trying to exclude any claims that my research has to being able to evaluate the empirical questions that some of your questions raise. I don't have the methodology really to parse out the different causal implications of various choices, so I have to base myself rather on existing literature and what we might reasonably expect in terms of responses. So I'm gonna largely park the more empirical queries for that reason, although I'd love to have a longer discussion about the expected kind of returns on these different approaches. Just to quickly pick up on your question about pluralist democracy at the EU level. So I think this is really interesting, and especially because it fits in very cleanly with my own analysis of some of what's missing, especially in the European Commission. Right, so the European Parliament is a place where we see more pluralism because we also see the representation of opposition parties, whereas at the Commission and the Council levels, we see a kind of broad opposition deficit. If you're out of government, you're out of the Council and out of any kind of direct influence on the Commission, which is I think undesirable. Now, of course, given the kind of restrictions that I've set on myself in terms of practice dependence, right? So not looking at things that would require treaty change. I think you're right that I would have rather had to look at more informal dialogue mechanisms of for example, civil society parties in the Commission and so forth. I guess one of the reasons I don't do that is that I have this kind of long-standing discomfort somewhat of the use by political elites of informal dialogue mechanisms as ways of kind of avoiding democratic political contestation. So this is based on the work of my late colleague Peter Mayer in his Ruling the Void and other such analyses where I maybe for that reason, unfairly kind of exclude that scope, because of course it's extremely important and where rapporteurs and where commission investigations include civil society actors, for example, on the situation in Hungary or Poland regarding the rule of law crises, they have been much more useful and much more interesting than when they have not. In terms of the broader challenge to the liberal democratic order, coming in part from the democratic people themselves, this is a super difficult issue, and one that I do indeed kind of sidestep in the book for the most part. The problem for me as a political theorist who's trying to analyze these things from the perspective of kind of initially procedural accounts of democracy and these fair and free conditions of democratic elections, is that these radical right-wing challenges to the liberal democratic order, they're taking place at the same time on two different levels, right? So they're taking place at the level of policy, where there's contestation over things like migration and things like the role of religion in society, the role of Islam, the role of Christian democracy in European states, or Christian principles, liberal Judeo-Christian values, sometimes people refer to this. So there's this kind of policy debate which plays out in abortion rights and so forth. And then there's also this constitutional level contestation, which is about for me, to frame it kind of technically, it's about it's about undermining the iterative nature of democratic procedures, right? So it's denying a future majority the freedom to overturn and to resist the executive, right? So it's not accidental, to take the example of Hungary again, it's not accidental that Viktor Orban at the same time is doing things like restricting freedom of speech regarding LGTB rights, is restricting the rights of academics, is narrowing down the rights of migrants, and trying to pursue a policy of almost total media domination, which undermines the possibility of a pluralist media, right? So these things are going in tandem, and not only in Hungary are they going in tandem, they're also going in tandem in the United States, in India, in Israel, in Brazil under Bolsonaro, right? In all these places where we see these radical right challenges. Now, the result is that it's very difficult as a democratic theorist to say, well, yes, these are simply the reflections of policy preferences. And here the challenge is, on the one hand, it's very paternalistic to say, well, the results of this election are unfair, right? Because we don't have a free media environment. But at the same time, it goes against democratic principle to say, well, these things don't matter. So we have to have a very kind of nuanced and careful approach, whereby we do indeed within this. So if we're very minimalist about what's necessary for liberal democracy, we say, okay, well, if we maintain only in that set those core civil and political rights, the equality of them, and their possible iterative nature as part of that set, and we don't try to sneak in all sorts of substantive political preferences, then we can say, okay, then we can hold that line of saying, okay, this undermines the people, right, including in their future manifestations, and we have to reject the view that this kind of illiberal democracy is on those terms possible. But it's an extremely difficult question, especially as you point out rightly, in the context of this wave of radical right challenges to liberal democratic order that we see across European countries and beyond. Maybe I leave that. I've already spoken maybe a little longer than I wanted to. We clearly do need to talk about the failures of the EU and European integration in terms of policy, but I always hesitate to give too much agency to European institutional actors here. Instead, maybe overly influenced by Chris Bickerton's first book on this topic, from nation states to member states, right? So the idea is that has stuck with me is that often in the case of these seeming policy failures at the EU level, this is really just better understood in terms of member states restricting their own freedom of movement with regard to pursuing certain policy options, right? So giving them an excuse not to act, and this kind of structured scapegoating of the EU level as being the easy valve where you can say as a national government, oh yeah, we'd have loved to do that, but it's not possible because of some EU rules. And then not saying those rules that we helped create and in fact support as being the thing. So maybe there needs to be more fundamental reflection on how to change that structural kind of scapegoating logic which member state governments can pursue. A logic which is very similar, actually. I'm thinking about this now off the cuff, but very similar to the current logic of the Dutch far right party, the PVV, which is both in the government and outside of the government, right? So they haven't put their most visible member in the cabinet, so they can in parliament continually criticize government activity, whereas in fact they make up the largest party in parliament and one of the governing, like the largest governing coalition member. This kind of logic is obviously very detrimental to the very idea of democratic accountability, which is, I think, one of the reasons why, at large, in the European context, people have become disillusioned with European integration. All right, lots of slightly left and right center thoughts, but thank you so much for your comments. Obviously, loads of room for further reflection and conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you both. We will now turn to the Q&A. Just to say to the audience that we will be putting this on YouTube in the coming days. So although we're over by time by a little bit, if you need to rewatch any parts, it will be available online. So the Q&A, I don't know if you're both able to see this. I will read it anyway, but in case it's also easier for you to read. First of all, we have a comment here. You begin with the analysis by looking at reaction from the core of the EU. However, it would be interesting to look at the political actors initiating the backsliding, i.e. the governments and the political actors in member states, and why the infringe of the democratic fundamentals, both legislative and political values, better to do your best to prevent rather than repair. And then regarding that comment, perhaps for a future volume. I don't know if you had a reflection on that. It's more of a comment, I think, than a question, but
I think those sorts of analyses were urgent and in hindsight extremely well, the gap in the literature on this topic is painful, but the time for those analyses was 15 or 20 years ago. Now, of course, it's continually interesting to ask when and why certain actors pursue illiberal and anti-democratic politics empirically, to ask that question in terms of the kind of causal factors that are at play there. That's beyond the scope of this book and the methods that I use, but it's obviously an important question. But to write a manual for how we would have avoided coming here if we would have acted differently, I'm putting it now uncharitably, but that would for me be something which is a little bit too late. No.
Thank you. And then a question here. First of all, compliment. Thank you for your excellent presentation and the engaging discussion of the book. So in the book, you mentioned that the expulsion mechanism may take shape through the threat of mass withdrawal of pro-democratic forces via the collective invocation of Article 50. Given the rapid developments following coalition talks in the Netherlands and Austria, among others, do you think the EU will, in the long term, one, there's only three options. One, stay liberal democratic. Two, will be divided into two groups. Or three, will it shift towards a Europe of nations while remaining united?
Very difficult to see where we're headed. Political dynamics, as we know, can change very rapidly. So even when things seem to be really set on one path, surprise is a continual feature of our discipline, including very recently, right? So if we look back just in the past few years, I would say that the re-election of Trump, for example, seemed extremely unlikely 3 years ago and became a reality. Maybe even much more. A much better example would be the resistance of Ukraine to Russian aggression. The very widely held view was that Ukraine would not be able to resist a full-scale Russian invasion for any significant amount of time, let alone counting into years. Geopolitical and political scientists, analysts have been deeply surprised by these developments. So I think we're not stuck. And one of the things that I think is the most hopeful about our discipline and about politics in general is this contingency, right? This possibility of quite radical change. At the same time, to speak to this mechanism specifically, which is this mass withdrawal of Article 50. I think it's highly unlikely that it would happen in any kind of near future. That's not the direction we're going. No member state is pushing for this, and the inclusion of that mechanism is not an attempt to lay out the kind of a likely near future scenario. Rather, I'm with this mechanism trying to do two things. So firstly, I'm speaking to a literature of public law, which is debating only relatively recently, so over the past 3 or 4 years, debating the possibility of expulsion in the current legal framework, with the idea that the treaties won't change. And there have been a few contributions along this line. There's Christophe Hillian, a French lawyer based in Oslo, has made an argument about certain types of backsliding constituting notice to withdraw under Article 50. A very highly debated contribution. There have been other suggestions that when expulsion is not within a treaty framework, you need to go more broadly to the general principles of public international law, like the Vienna Convention on Treaties, to look for the rights of signatories in those circumstances. This is my own contribution to that debate. The idea is to shift the conversation from the kind of knee-jerk, it's not in the treaty, so it's impossible, to, well, maybe it's possible, so let's talk about whether it's legitimate, and let's talk about whether it's desirable, and let's try to change the kind of terms of the conversation from this kind of fatalistic, we could not do anything anyway, to no, maybe it matters, to actually think about what concretely the political red lines would be amongst liberal democratic member states. I do think if I were to try to gaze in a crystal ball, I think multi-speed Europe, so increasingly kind of small and disparate and perhaps even changing coalitions of liberal democratic states deciding for certain things to step outside of the European Union framework in a kind of piecemeal fashion to avoid block and veto threats by liberal governments. I think that's a likely near future scenario, and we can already see a little bit of that. So whereas Hungary gained massive concessions in terms of conditionality in exchange for its veto on Ukraine aid in 2023, a coalition of Scandinavian and Western European countries decided to go outside of the European Council framework to provide aid to Ukraine rather recently at the end of 2024. I think we'll see more of that kind of thing as we have more veto players from the radical right undermining these sorts of decisions in the council.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you again, Tom and Vivian, for your contributions today. It's been really fascinating, great conversation to be a part of. And well, that brings us to time. So good afternoon, everybody. I hope you continue to have a lovely day. And as I say, this will be on YouTube in the coming days. So if you want to rewatch any parts or share with colleagues or others that you know would find this interesting as well, follow us on YouTube. All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Vivian.
Goodbye.